A 7-year-old is torn from his mother at dawn. By nightfall, he learns the first Spartan lesson. Pain speaks, mercy doesn't. They took him at 7. The city called it the agoge, a word that meant a leading, a driving, and it began with separation. Boys peeled from households and driven into herds under the eye of a paidonomos, the boy herdsman, and an iron, the older youth who enforced obedience with voice, glare, and sometimes fist. In the barracks, the air smelled of rushes and sweat. Names thinned into ranks. Friendship shrank into silent tests. Tradition laid the system at the feet of Lycurgus, a lawgiver half shadow, half steel, and later voices, Xenophon, Plutarch, would praise its edges and wince at its costs. The logic was blunt. Endurance in the body, obedience in the bones. The child's breath met the institution's ritual. The private heartbeat learned the city's drum. Food arrived thin on purpose. Bowls that mocked hunger, a broth that warmed nothing. Scarcity was not a mistake. It was instruction. Boys were ordered to steal and then told that the crime was not theft, but failure. Failure to be unseen, unheard, untouched. Punishment landed for getting caught, not taking bread. It taught the hands to move like water and the mind to live in shadows. The stomach tightened into a tutor. The ribs wrote out the alphabet of cunning. In corridors and storerooms, a whisper became a weapon. The city baked hunger into the curriculum and called it prudence. The body learned the ground. Bare feet toughened on gravel until the skin remembered stones as old friends. One cloak for the year, in winter wind and summer dust, so that temperature, like pity, became a rumor. At night, reeds were cut and pulled, self-made bedding that pricked until the skin forgot comfort's grammar. Beatings were not accidents of cruelty, but instruments, metronomes that set the tempo of submission. A boy stood straighter after a blow. A group stood tighter after a round of them. Stoic posture was not a philosophy. It was a scar taught to pose as virtue. In the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, the lesson became spectacle. The diamastigosis, flogging, turned the altar into a stage and endurance into a civic hymn. Boys were whipped until knees unspooled and teeth found blood, some collapsing to the earth like offerings. The crowd did not look away. The crowd learned what the city loved. To endure was to be seen. To cry out was to be marked. Archaeology would later sift votives and masks. Texts would name the rite. Together they confirmed that Sparta made pain public and called it piety. Under torchlight, the god watched, and so did the law. Fear lived here, but it was trained like a dog, not banished, disciplined. Dawn runs taught breath to ignore panic's claw. Cold nights taught thought to keep a straight spine when the body begged. The iron's sudden commands jerked the nervous system like reins, until startle became a nod and obedience became muscle memory. Surveillance pressed down from above and pressed in from beside. Peers who reported, superiors who listened. A city that peered through keyholes of ritual. Humiliation was not random. It was ritual, a furnace for identity, melting boyhood into the metal of citizen warrior. Names and dates mattered because they carried the weight of proof. Lycurgus's name, whether one man or many laws, gave the story its charter, while Xenophon's sparse admiration and Plutarch's moral anecdotes preserved the outline that had bitten into so many backs. The sanctuary of Artemis Orthia grounded the memory in soil and stone. Between text and altar, a pattern emerged. The agoge was not rumor. It was a machine, inputs of children, outputs of hoplites, and the gears were bruises. The myth said Spartans did not feel fear. The training said otherwise. They felt it early and learned to ride it. The boy's first theft was a tremor, his first successful silence, a lesson, his first flogging, a treaty with pain he could never fully sign. Fear was folded, not erased, tucked into posture and song, the tremble redistributed into the phalanx where many bodies made one courage. The city's cold logic threaded through every ritual, break the private self to build the public wall. By nightfall, the 7-year-old knew the grammar of this place. Hunger as teacher, cold as tutor, pain as proof. He had a cloak and a bowl, and a place on a reed mat that stabbed. He had eyes that watched the paidonomos for the twitch that meant move, a throat that rehearsed silence, and a back that understood the meaning of the switch. Above all, he had new pronouns. Not I, but we, not mine, but ours, not mercy, but measure. The city had begun its work. If childhood was the furnace, Adolescence became the blade. They sent selected youths into the dark and called it education. The city thinned them from the herd, those with quiet feet, colder eyes, and loosed them into the countryside without sandals, without beds, with only knives and instructions that sounded like prayers, but landed like sentences. The word was krypteia, to hide, to be hidden. They slept in thickets and ditches, learned the smell of wet earth and the taste of their own breath. By day they watched from stone fences and olive groves. By night they moved like the wind's shadow. The iron's voice had become a pulse inside their heads. Observe, endure, obey. Terror was not an accident of this training. It was its instrument. The targets were helots, the people conquered and bound to work the land, the foundation that fed the Spartan messes and paid for steel, oil, and time to train. Each year the ephors, those stern magi, strates of the Spartan state, declared ritual war on the helots so that killing would be legal, cleansed by theology, washed in the city's logic. Religion bent into policy, and policy slipped a blade between ribs. This was the arithmetic of control, a small citizen body perched on a much larger subject population, stabilized not by walls, but by fear that walked on two legs and breathed quietly. The youths learned to read footprints like sentences and to map gossip like rivers. One cut throat at a time, the message was carved. The state is awake. The curriculum was fieldcraft. They learned to live off scraps, to water their mouths with dew before dawn, to chew raw grain, to strip bark for string, to bind a wound with a torn hem. Reconnaissance became a catechism. Count the cooking fires, mark the paths to wells, note who sang, who limped, who looked over a shoulder too often. Camouflage was not a cloak, it was a decision, to become a bush, a shadow, a stain. Commands were whispers, gestures, touches on the wrist. The body learned to erase its edges. In a still pond, even a breath is a splash. The moral ledger warped. Killing by moonlight did not feel like the sunlit clash of phalanxes, where law and song and bronze framed courage. This felt private, and because it was private, it bit deeper. The city asked boys to do the state's dirtiest arithmetic and promised them honor as payment. Some learned to flatten their feelings into a blade's line. Others learned to bury the tremor under a chant. The shared secrecy welded them to one another. Blood made its own brotherhood, and silence made its own vow. Later, in ranks, they would stand shoulder to shoulder and not need to speak, because they had already kept each other's night. There was debate then, and there is debate now, about how formal the krypteia truly was. Initiation rite or counterinsurgency, ritual or policy. But the effect was plain in the way farmers lowered voices, in the way doorways were checked twice, in the way rumors traveled faster than wagons. The selection itself taught a lesson. Sparta valued eyes that did not blink, hands that did not shake, hearts that could be tuned like a lyre to a single note. Duty. From thickets to thresholds, the youths practiced a grammar of pressure. Show up where fear would multiply, disappear where hatred would gather, keep the balance forever off-center. Suspense stretched every night into a wire. A snapped twig could mean a sprint, a shout, a knife's quick decision. The silence around them grew teeth. In that quiet, they learned what the agoge had promised. Fear does not vanish. It is harnessed. Breath fell into meter. Pupils widened to the moon's thin coin. A rooster's early call could be a signal or a trap. A dog's bark could be a hazard or a map. They learned to listen to insects, to wind through barley, to the lag between a heartbeat and a thought. Every sound became a test of nerve. And so the city's theology and its politics braided together. The ephor's war declaration was more than legal cover. It was a ritual mask that let the community watch itself do violence and still speak of purity. The young men were both actors and audience, absorbing doctrine through action. In that mask, the state's face sharpened. We are few, we must be hard. And hardness requires someone else's softness to compress. Helot fear kept Sparta light on its feet. Helot labor kept Sparta fed. The knife's edge balanced the whole constitution. The myth of fearlessness cracked here too. Courage revealed itself not as an absence of fear, but as a posture learned under it. The youths felt the shake. They disciplined it into stillness. They felt the urge to run. They rethreaded it into patience. When dawn came and the olive leaves silvered, they crawled back into hedges and let ants march over their hands without flinching. Each night's work, added a grain to the city's hourglass. Time bought not with walls, but with whispers. By the time they re-entered the sunlight, their eyes had changed. The parade ground's order felt almost kind after the countryside's ambiguity. They had learned reconnaissance, camouflage, tracking, and silent command. They had drunk from the same canteen of secrecy. The city looked cleaner from the dark. It was an illusion the state was happy to maintain. What waited now was form, the geometry of rank and file, shields kissing, spears in cadence, the transformation of private terror into public choreography, from whispered violence to parade ground sunlight. The making of the hoplite machine was next. Morning drilled the body into a clock. They ran before the sun found the river, feet stitching lines across Spartan soil, lungs taught to spend air like coin, never waste, never hoard. Wrestling scraped the skin and taught leverage where strength failed. Pancration blurred the rules until instinct learned to choose the ugly solution over the pretty defeat. Wooden spears became extensions of breath, shields, extensions of spine. Every drill braided individual reflex into group timing, and the ground itself felt rehearsed, as if the city had turned Earth into a training partner. The lesson was not heroism, it was geometry. Angles of approach, planes of pressure, the clean arithmetic of bodies moving as a single will. On the parade ground, pride was measured in synchronization, the iron called cadence. Voices answered as one. A boy who had learned to steal now learned not to stand out. Shield edge kissed shield rim, a chain of bronze that made private heartbeats irrelevant. Swordplay was taught but secondary. The real art lived in the wall, the phalanx, where courage became distributive property. The strongest man could not hold a line alone. The most frightened could be steadied by touch and timing. Boots thudded in unison until fear mistook the suit. And for safety, the city had discovered a human equation. 1 + 1, repeated enough times with discipline, becomes a fortress that walks. Diet made a creed out of scarcity. Bowls filled with the famous black broth, blood-rich, salt-bitten, a taste that curled the lip, a lesson that flavor is the enemy of purpose. Meat appeared rarely, ritualistically, so that hunger stayed a permanent tutor. Rations were calibrated to sharpen the senses, to keep the body lean, to keep theft an ever-open classroom. The stomach wrote rules on the nerves: conserve heat, pace effort, steal when necessary, never be caught. The body's chemistry bowed to policy. Stress hormones trained to rise on command and settle on command, a metronome inside the ribs that synchronized with the city's drum. But the body keeps receipts. Bones recorded the impact of miles run on scant fuel. Shins hummed with hairline fissures. Knees confessed to repetition. Reeds used as bedding left a constellation of cuts that invited infection. Stripes from ritual beatings raised welts that split and healed into maps of discipline. In the absence of modern salves, the young learned folk medicine by necessity. Vinegar washes, oil rubbed into bruises, prayers muttered to harden skin and will. Every scar stood both as qualification and as quiet tax. The city did not say, "This will cost you." The body said it for the city. Song and dance were not softness intruding on hardness. They were engineering. Marching hymns aligned steps and breath. Choruses threaded individuals into a single tempo. The same mouths that clenched against broth's bite opened to rehearse harmony, training the diaphragm to ration air through panic. War dances, a hop, a heel, a stamp, mapped muscle memory to rhythm so that in battle, the phalanx could feel rather than think its pivots. In song, fear was metabolized into pattern. In dance, aggression was rehearsed without casualties. The arts were not decoration. They were scaffolding for courage. A comparison made the Spartan choice clear by contrast. In Athens, the palaestra celebrated the body in a looser grammar, wider diet, broader debate, wrestling beside rhetoric. The ephebic training there aimed at a citizen who might fight, vote, sail, argue. Sparta stripped options until only one remained. Stand in line, hold the weight, push. The difference was audible. Athenian marketplaces rang with voices. Spartan mess halls murmured with measured speech. The divergence did not make one city superior and another monstrous. It revealed what each feared most. Athens feared tyranny. Sparta feared dissolution. Each trained accordingly. The myth of the superhuman Spartan needed the corrective of the mess line and the sick bed. They were not invulnerable. They blistered, limped, coughed through winters, bled at Orthia, broke in quiet ways that discipline hid. What terrified opponents was not mystical strength, but consistency. The promise that the line would be where it was supposed to be, at the moment it was supposed to be there, full of men who had learned to cancel themselves into the group. Courage here was choreography. Steps drilled until the mind could panic, and the feet would still perform. By dusk, the day closed with the same tightness as it opened. Cloaks pulled close, bodies lay on reed mats that insisted on vigilance even in rest. In the dim, the day's geometry replayed behind closed eyes. Shield, spear, step, breath. The stomach was not full, the feet were not soft, the back was not unmarked. Yet a wall had been rehearsed, a moving fortress constructed from hunger and harmony. Walls of men, not stone, the old saying went, and in the mind's inner theatre, the pass at Thermopylae narrowed to a blade's width. There, the system would be tested, not on sanded parade grounds, but in a gorge where wind funneled the smell of bronze and fear. The camera moves now to that narrow throat of Greece. Thermopylae, 480 BCE, a narrow pass where mountains shouldered sea, and the wind funneled salt and iron into a single breath. Leonidas stood with his chosen men, fathers of living sons, so that the city would not be orphaned, facing Xerxes' advancing world of spears. What the agoge had promised now arrived in bronze and sweat, not supermen, but a line that refused to forget itself. Shields touched, breath synchronized, fear learned its place behind the shield rim. The geometry drilled in Sparta met the Persian tide, and for 3 days the tide broke into foam against the human wall. The scene was not myth, even though myth later soaked it. Scouts had already tested the ground. The phalanx angled to choke numbers into irrelevance. Spears leveled, then rose for the slow thrust. The front rank took the crash. The second rank steadied. The third drove forward like a thought finishing a sentence. Songs leaked through gritted teeth, keeping time when pain tried to scramble it. In the crush, names dissolved, but training persisted. Push, hold, replace, reset. The past turned the Spartan syllabus into a battlefield thesis. Discipline reduces chance. There was brilliance in choosing the terrain. A thin corridor negated cavalry and curbed envelopment, making Persian masses queue up for punishment. Leonidas did not gamble on strength. He invested in constraint. It worked, until it didn't, until a local path, whispered into Persian ears by Ephialtes, looped around like a snake and bit the wall in the back. The Spartans were not surprised by the existence of betrayal. They were prepared only for its timing. The line pivoted to inevitability. Strategy had been perfect for 3 days. Contingency had been patient for 3 days. Both kept their appointments. The deaths were not waste. They were messaging. Greece watched. Allies measured their own pulses against the rhythm at the pass and found courage they had not budgeted for. The agoge had bought something invisible but durable, an example that could be spent later at Salamis and Plataea. The ledger of war is not filled only with territory and bodies. It is written in morale and delay, in the bought hours during which fleets assemble, councils harden, cities choose. Thermopylae purchased time at a price only a culture like Sparta could pay, without flinching. Now the puncture, what the training hid. The Spartan mirage, scholars would later call it, the glow that turned complexity into a statue. Behind the gleam stood helot labor, the quiet engine that financed bronze and boredom, that underwrote the luxury of endless drilling. Behind the hard faces stood demographic fragility, Spartiates shrinking over generations as land concentrated, as casualties and inheritance laws pinched the citizen body into an elite so narrow it could not replenish itself. The agoge produced cohesion, but the society surrounding it bled numbers from the top. Sparta's greatness was brittle. The very rules that hardened the line also hardened the class system until it cracked. Property concentrated in fewer hands. Full citizens dwindled. The pipeline from boy to hoplite became a funnel too tight to fill the ranks. The city compensated with fear at home and reputation abroad, but accounts come due. By 371 BCE at Leuctra, Theban innovation and a new geometry, deep columns, concentrated shock, met the old wall and found its fault lines. The legend did not die. It simply floated above the battlefield like incense, smelling of courage and ignoring arithmetic. The political economy had always been the hidden co-author of Spartan valor. Women's estates, helot harvests, and the iron currency of obedience bound together into a constitution that refused softness. The price was paid in silence, in the villages where whispers replaced laugh, in the Sicilia, where conformity passed for fellowship, in the thinning rosters of men who could call themselves equal. The city projected strength because it could not afford conversation. This was the paradox carved into its laws. To remain what it was, it had to become less of itself. And yet, what a performance when terrain and training agreed. The pass radiated the very virtues the agoge had hoarded: steadiness, mutual reliance, a choreography of courage that made death a tactic. Herodotus would preserve sayings, laconic sparks that flattered later ears, and poets would hammer grief into hexameter. The mirage grew from real heat, but it was a mirage all the same, a simplification that left out the scaffolding and the shadows. The camera lifts from the bodies at the hot gates to the households that produced them. If Thermopylae was the public altar where Sparta burned its best incense, the city had a private shrine as well. Motherhood rescripted as a forge, infants measured against rumor and rule, bodies disciplined before they could choose. From the narrow pass to the narrow crib, the state did not begin with the shield. It began with the womb, cut now to smaller rooms and stricter whispers, where the chant of endurance is taught without a drum. In Sparta, motherhood was a rank with orders. The city trained women not only for childbirth, but for the politics of birth, bodies conditioned to bear stronger children, voices tuned to a script that wrapped love around iron. With it or on it, a mother was said to tell her son, meaning the shield, meaning return in honor, or not at all. Training for girls, running, wrestling, throwing, was not sentiment. It was policy, a eugenic overtone humming beneath hymns to civic virtue. The household became an antechamber to the phalanx. A woman's endurance, her appetite, her laughter, her tongue, each was recruited to the state's rhythm, each made to march in step with the city's need for future men in bronze. Infancy sat beneath the same hard gaze. Tradition held that newborns were inspected, fit or unfit, a judgment wrapped in the vague cloth of law and law, an aperture through which rumor and ideology peered at a face that had barely learned to blink. Whether every tale was true mattered less than what the tales performed. An idea that the city, not the family, owned the first word and the last. Exposure stories, cold ground in winter, wind testing tiny lungs, haunted the edges of the cradle. Demography paid the bill. Each decision, real or ritualized, chipped at numbers, and numbers were destiny for a state that prized sameness over growth. A pipeline this narrow could not afford cracks. Sparta lived with fractures anyway. Surveillance did not end with childhood. Life threaded through the Sicilia, those common messes where men ate the same bread, drank the same wine, and practiced the soft discipline of sameness. Hair was grown or cut to code. Clothing signaled compliance. Speech itself wore a uniform, laconic, tight, disciplined. Identity became a barracks. To belong was to perform belonging, to calibrate appetite and anecdote to the city's metronome. Even in affection, restraint rehearsed itself. The uniform did not hang in closets. It lived in posture and pronoun, in the way a man held a cup, in the way a woman lifted her chin when a son marched past. The polis legislated gestures, and the people obliged by turning their bodies into law. But the exit wound of training did not always bleed where outsiders could see. Aging hoplites limped on old geometry, knees that remembered the push of Thermopylae in quieter lanes where barley whispered. The lash at Orthia had long faded, but its echo lived in startled responses, in dreams that flinched at torches and chants, in silences at Sicilia, where memories crowded out appetite. Households bore the balance sheet, wives adjusting to men who measured emotion in drill counts, children who learned quickly which questions not to ask, helot communities absorbing the unspent force of a system that required friction to stay warm. Trauma did not have a word here. It had a ritual. Carry on. Decline threaded through these rooms. After Leuctra in 371 BCE, the wall cracked and did not knit. Reformers, names like Agis and Cleomenes in later centuries, pressed fingers against the fracture, proposing property redistributions, enrollments, revivals of the hard old ways. But demography and economics, those invisible generals, commanded more soldiers than kings did. The citizen list thinned. Equality turned into a password fewer could speak honestly. Meanwhile, the legend prospered. Renaissance pens sharpened Sparta into a moral example. Modern screens painted abs and shields into a catechism of courage, forgetting the cost ledger in kitchens and fields. Myth harvested the glory. Reality tilled the soil. The chant of endurance had always traveled on two roads. One public, paved with bronze and hymns. One private, paved with chores and quiet. In the private, Spartan women carried contradictions with practiced grace, expected to speak boldly and yet not too freely, to manage estates, and yet remain symbols of submission to the state's higher hunger. Helot mothers learned to layer fear beneath routine, to count footsteps, to teach children which shadows meant safety and which meant the sea eye. Tai had sent boys into the night again. The constitution of Sparta extended into cradles it never officially recognized, writing policy on the backs of those who could not sign it. And still, inside the hardness, a tenderness survived in camouflage. A mother's hand on a boy's cheek at dawn, a shared joke in the mess that dodged the censors of tone, a reed mat adjusted so a scar would not reopen. The state did not design these mercies. It survived on them anyway. They were the grease in the machine, the favor that kept gears from seizing. If there was betrayal here, it was history's, turning these minor salvations into footnotes beneath major battles. The camera fades from the parade ground to a folded cloak on a stone. The chant has grown faint, the lash gone quiet, the broth cold in an unlifted bowl. Sparta offered the world a ritual of courage and demanded from its people a ritual of cost. Did it create unbreakable warriors, or a society that broke its children first and called the fracture a virtue? The answer sits where the shield meets the hand, in the pressure required to hold a line, and in the hand that must someday let it go.